Last week, we looked at the debate between rationalism and nativism on the one side, and empiricism on the other side. We saw that Locke forwards a two-pronged argument for empiricism. On the one hand, Locke argues that there's no such thing as an innate idea. This is the argument of Locke's we looked at last week, and we also considered Leibniz's response. This week, we'll be looking at the second prong. Locke attempts to show that all the ideas we in fact have do derive from sense experience. So this week, we'll be considering Locke's argument and a response from Berkeley. Before getting into the details, it seems that it would be easy for Locke, or at least relatively easy for Locke, to account for our ideas of colors and smells and tastes and sounds. The challenge for Locke will be accounting for ideas of ours that go beyond the immediate effects of bodies on our senses. The challenge for Locke will be to account for how we form ideas that represent bodies themselves. Now, Locke begins his discussion by drawing a distinction between ideas and qualities. An idea is whatever is before the mind when the mind is active. So an idea is what's before the mind in perceiving, or in thinking, or in wondering, or hoping, or fearing. A quality, by contrast, Locke defines as the power of a body to produce an idea in us. Now, having drawn this distinction between ideas and qualities, Locke provides an argument that we can distinguish among our ideas between ideas of primary qualities and ideas of secondary qualities. Locke defines primary qualities as qualities that are really in bodies and are inseparable from bodies, no matter what state bodies are in or what changes they undergo. Locke illustrates this definition with the following example. He writes, "Take a grain of wheat, divide it into two parts. Each part still has solidity, extension, figure, and mobility. Divide it again, and it retains still the same qualities. And so divided on, till the parts become insensible. They must retain still, each of them, all those qualities. For division can never take away either solidity, extension, figure, or mobility from any body." So this is Locke's list of the primary qualities: solidity, extension, figure, and mobility. In contrast, Locke defines secondary qualities as being nothing in bodies themselves other than powers to produce sensations in us by their insensible primary qualities. And the secondary qualities for Locke are colors, smells, tastes, sounds, and feels. The third criterion Locke offers us to distinguish primary qualities from secondary qualities is that our ideas' primary qualities resemble the primary qualities in the bodies that cause these ideas, while our ideas of secondary qualities do not resemble anything at all in bodies. In particular, our secondary quality ideas do not resemble the insensible primary qualities in the bodies that actually cause these ideas. Now, Locke claims that we commonly mistake secondary qualities for primary qualities. So for this reason, he runs through a series of examples to convince us of this distinction. Locke's first example is of a fire. Locke thinks that we commonly suppose that the fire is hot, but Locke thinks this is a mistake, and he aims to show us it's a mistake by taking us through a thought experiment. Locke suggests that at a certain distance, the fire causes in us the sensation of heat. But at a much closer distance, Locke points out, the fire causes in us the sensation of pain. And of course, at a much farther distance, the fire won't cause the sensation of heat in us, but the mere sensation of warmth. Locke points out that no one would ever say the fire is painful. Pain is obviously just a sensation in us caused by the fire. But now consider, why is it obvious that pain is just a sensation in us caused by the fire? The thought is that the sensation of pain is caused in us by the fire is dependent on our distance to the fire. But now, the key point that Locke wants to draw our attention to is that the feeling of heat is equally dependent on our distance from the fire. If we're one distance from the fire, we'll experience a sensation of pain. If we're another distance from the fire, we'll experience a sensation of heat. And if we're yet another distance from the fire, we'll experience a sensation of warmth. So the thought is, warmth, heat, and pain are all equally dependent on our distance from the fire. So just as pain is not in the fire, neither is heat or warmth. These are merely sensations in us, caused by the fire. The fire is neither painful, hot, or warm. The fire has certain insensible primary qualities that cause in us sensations: pain, heat, and warmth, depending on our distance from the fire. So, our ideas of pain, heat, and warmth are all equally secondary quality ideas. They are nothing in the fire, but the power of the fire by its insensible primary qualities to cause these sensations in us. Now, this first example of the fire shows that secondary quality ideas can be dependent on our distance from bodies. The second example, that of the mana, is meant to show that secondary qualities are dependent on the quantity of the object that affects us. So the thought here is, we commonly suppose that mana is sweet, but what Locke points out is that while, when eaten in some reasonable quantity, the mana tastes sweet, when eaten in excess, mana causes in us not feelings of sweetness, but instead feelings of sickness. So Locke's argument is just as we would never say that the mana is itself sick, then we should likewise not say that the mana is sweet, because both the sickness and the sweetness that we sense depend on the quantity of the mana that we taste. Hence, sweetness, just like sickness, is a secondary quality. It's nothing but a sensation in us caused by insensible primary qualities of the mana. Locke's third example, his example of porphyry, is meant to show us that secondary qualities also depend on the perceptual conditions. So Locke thinks that we would commonly describe porphyry as a red and white rock. But what Locke points out is that while porphyry causes in us sensations of red and white when it's perceived in natural light, if we look at porphyry in the dark, it doesn't cause any ideas of color in us at all. Another example here might be that if we look at a banana in white light, it appears yellow to us. But if we look at a banana under blue light, it'll appear green to us. So while we might commonly say that bananas are yellow, this is strictly speaking a mistake. The idea we have of yellow doesn't resemble anything actually in the banana. There's nothing in the banana but the power to cause ideas of yellow in us under white light and ideas of other colors in us under other colored lights. So in this way, colors are all secondary qualities because they depend on perceptual conditions. Locke's final example is a bucket of water. What Locke points out here is that if we have a single bucket of water in one hand that we've just taken out of the oven and another hand that we've just taken out of the freezer, and we put both hands in that same bucket of water, the water will feel hot to the hand that's just come out of the freezer, and the water will feel cold to the hand that's just come out of the oven. So the point is that the water is neither hot nor cold. Hot and cold are just sensations in our hands caused by the water. We might commonly think that the water is hot or the water is cold, but what Locke's example is meant to show us is that hot and cold are nothing in the water but powers to produce feelings of hot and cold in us by the water's insensible primary qualities. So hot and cold are secondary qualities. They are just sensations in our hands and nothing in the water itself. Now, on the face of it, I think this distinction that Locke's drawing between primary and secondary qualities is a really natural distinction to draw. I think a lot of us have learned that the way color vision works is that objects reflect certain wavelengths of light, and that when those wavelengths of light affect our eyes, they cause us to experience sensations of yellow or sensations of red. But red and yellow aren't really in the objects. What's in the objects is just the power to reflect various wavelengths of light and absorb other wavelengths. And I think we've learned a similar thing about sounds. If I pluck the string of a violin, it causes a vibration in the air. And when that vibration of the air affects my hearing, it causes in me the sensation of an A or a C sharp. Point is, the A or the C sharp isn't really in the string. What the string is doing is vibrating, and those vibrations are causing sensations of A or C sharp in us. So this is Locke's basic idea, I think. What's really in the string is a certain movement. The sound is just in us. What's really in things are certain textures, properties by which things absorb and reflect light. And what's in us are the colors. So the natural idea is that primary qualities are mind-independent qualities, and our primary quality ideas are ideas of real qualities in the bodies, while secondary qualities are mind-dependent. Our secondary quality ideas are just ideas in our minds. That said, I think the precise way Locke formulates his primary and secondary quality distinction is a bit confused. For consider, Locke says that primary quality ideas resemble the qualities in the bodies that cause these ideas, while secondary quality ideas don't. This makes it sound like my idea of an equilateral triangle is a primary quality idea. There's a certain way that my idea of an equilateral triangle looks. It has three equal sides that meet at three equal angles. And the thought is, equilateral triangles out in the world really look just like that. But on the other hand, Locke's first criterion for distinguishing primary from secondary qualities says that primary qualities are inseparable from the body, no matter what change it undergoes. So consider, if I have an equilateral triangle and I cut it in half, do I still have an equilateral triangle? No, I now have an acute triangle. And if I cut this triangle in half again, I may be left with a shape that's not triangular at all. So the problem is, Locke's resemblance criterion makes it look like particular primary quality ideas, like the idea of an equilateral triangle or an acute triangle are the primary qualities. But Locke's first criterion makes it look like particular qualities aren't the primary qualities at all. But instead, the primary qualities are generic qualities, like having extension, having some figure or other, not having some particular weight, but having mass in general, or not having some particular speed, but being movable in general. I think this is an ambiguity in the way that Locke draws the primary-secondary quality distinction. Ultimately, though, I think that it's the particular primary qualities, qualities like being an equilateral triangle, or being an isosceles triangle, that Locke thinks really inhere in the bodies. For Locke later says that all qualities of body are particular. He says everything that exists is particular, and Locke claims that general ideas are all products of our understanding. Locke thinks that all the ideas we acquire from sensation are ideas of particular qualities, and Locke thinks we form general quality ideas through the process of abstraction. Locke explains that abstraction proceeds by separating from particular quality ideas the circumstances of time and place. Locke offers a silly and old-fashioned sort of example. He imagines that the first person a child meets is the child's nurse, and that the child learns the name nurse for this particular individual. Then Locke imagines the second person the child is its mother. Locke imagines that once the child notices some similarities between the nurse and the mother, the child forms the idea of woman. And then Locke supposes, when the child finally gets around to meeting its father, it notices the similarities between the father, the nurse, and the mother, and finally comes by the idea of person. Now, despite this being one of the world's stupidest examples, I think we can see that Locke's point is that the way we form general ideas is by noticing what's similar among the various particular sensations we have of things. And now, it's because our general ideas are formed by our noticing various similarities that Locke calls our general ideas creatures of the understanding. All of our general ideas have been created by us in our noticing similarities among various particular things. And now, this is why Locke draws a distinction between the nominal essence of things and what he calls the real essence of things. For Locke, the nominal essence of something is the general term that we apply to that sort of thing. Right? So the thought is, by noticing what's in common among the nurse, the mother, and the father, the child comes up with the definition of a person. Or the thought is, by noticing what's in common among a bunch of rocks, we come to define gold as a yellow metal that's malleable and soluble in aqua regia, which is what Locke calls hydrochloric acid. Now, Locke calls this the nominal essence because it's our name for the kind of thing. And Locke points out that the nominal essences of things are mind-dependent, since of course the definitions of things are created by us in our noticing similarities among things. The real essence, by contrast, is what makes a thing the kind of thing that it is. For Locke, this is a mind-independent matter. The real essence of a thing is the constitution of the insensible parts of the thing, on which all its sensible qualities depend. Now, Locke thinks that real essences are unknowable by us. Indeed, they're unknowable by us by definition. And so the thought is, the real essence of gold, let's say, is what explains why gold has all of the sensible qualities it in fact has. But since all our ideas of gold come by sense perception, all we can have ideas of are the sensible qualities of the gold. We can't have ideas of whatever that real essence of gold is, on which its sensible qualities depend. Of course, we would like our definition of gold to match the real essence of gold. When we notice what's common among all the pieces of gold, we try to pick out similarities to use to define gold that match up with the real essence of gold. But what Locke points out is that there's no way we can ever get behind the sensible qualities, as it were, to see whether our nominal essence in fact matches the real essence. Now, this is a result of Locke's that Berkeley balks at. Berkeley is an empiricist like Locke. He thinks that all our ideas derive from sense perception. And in the preface of Three Dialogues, Berkeley complains that upon the common principles of philosophers, we are taught to distinguish their real nature from that which falls under our senses, and hence arise skepticism and paradoxes. Berkeley's goal in Three Dialogues is to retain empiricism, but to avoid the sort of skepticism that Berkeley thinks, in fact, follows from Locke's principles. And the principles that Berkeley has in mind are chiefly the primary-secondary quality distinction. So what we're going to look at today is Berkeley's criticism of Locke's primary-secondary quality distinction. And next time, we're going to consider what alternative principles to Locke's Berkeley thinks follows from this criticism. What we'll see is how Berkeley tries to retain a Lockean empiricism while avoiding skepticism. So now, let's look at Berkeley's criticism of Locke's primary-secondary quality distinction. What Berkeley wants to show is that all the considerations that Locke adduces in order to convince us that secondary qualities are mind-dependent go just the same to show that all the qualities Locke calls primary qualities are equally mind-dependent. Right, so the thought is, all the considerations that Locke used to show that colors, tastes, sounds, smells, and feels are just ideas in us, and nothing in the bodies. Berkeley wants to show extension, figure, solidity, and motion are also just ideas in us, and nothing at all in bodies. So in this way, just as Locke argued against Descartes that there's no such thing as an innate idea, Berkeley is going to argue against Locke that there's no such thing as a primary quality. So first, Berkeley considers particular qualities of figure and extension. For example, qualities like large, or round, or small, or octagonal. And now, remember that Locke showed qualities of hot and cold aren't real qualities in the water, but just ideas in us, since they depend on the constitution of our sense organs. If my hand has just been in the freezer, the same water will feel hot that feels cold to a hand that's just been in the oven. But now Berkeley points out, just as qualities of hot and cold depend on the constitution of our sense organs, so too do ideas of large and small, or even round and octagonal, depend on the acuity of our sense organs. Berkeley asks us to consider what shape and what extension things would appear to have if we had the eyes of mites. Or alternatively, what figure and extension would things appear to have if our eyes were outfitted with microscopic lenses? So the thought is, something that looks round to us might look octagonal if our eyes had higher acuity, like the eyes of a mite must, or like a microscopic lens does. So Berkeley's argument is that just as our ideas of hot and cold are nothing in the objects, but the powers to produce ideas in us, because our ideas of hot and cold depend on the constitution of our sense organs, so too our ideas of particular extensions or particular figures are nothing in the bodies, but powers to produce ideas of large and small or round and octagonal in us. So next, Berkeley takes on motion and rest. While he doesn't give any examples here, the point he makes is that all of our ideas of motion are relative. And I think the argument of Locke that this is most similar to is Locke's argument that colors depend on perceptual conditions. Recall that when Locke discussed the example of porphyry, he showed that while porphyry appears red and white in white light, it appears to have no color at all in the dark, and porphyry would appear purple and blue under blue light. The conclusion that Locke drew from these considerations is that colors are nothing in the bodies, but just ideas in us, because all of our color sensations depend on the perceptual conditions. Now, what Berkeley points out is that all of our ideas about movement and rest also depend on perceptual conditions. For an example, we could consider the perceptions of motion and rest we have when we're at rest versus when we're moving. So if we're in a moving vehicle and look outside of the vehicle, things appear to be moving that might appear to be at rest if we were at rest. Likewise, things might appear to be moving backwards that would appear to be moving forwards if we were at rest. And just the same, if we're in a vehicle moving backwards and look at an object outside the vehicle, it might appear to be moving forwards when it would appear to be at rest if we were at rest. So the point is, all of the particular ideas of motion and rest that we obtain through sense perception are dependent on the general perceptual conditions, specifically our own condition of being in motion or at rest. The final primary quality that Locke enumerates and that Berkeley discusses is solidity. Now, Berkeley acknowledges that we commonly think of butter as being soft and iron as being hard. But Berkeley thinks that's just as much of a mistake as any of the other secondary qualities that Locke acknowledges we mistake for primary qualities. After all, what Berkeley points out is that if our limbs had a stronger constitution or a weaker constitution, iron might feel soft and butter might feel hard. So the conclusion that Berkeley thinks we should draw from this is that hardness and softness aren't really in the iron or the butter. They're just ideas in us, since they depend on the constitution of our sense organs. Now, I said before that I think the primary-secondary quality distinction is a natural distinction to draw, but I think Berkeley's criticism of the primary-secondary quality distinction is just as natural, although Berkeley's examples might be contentious. His basic idea is that all the ideas that we derive through sense perception are dependent on the constitution of our sense organs. And now, since Berkeley and Locke are both empiricists, the upshot is that since all the ideas that we have are ideas that we derive from sense perception, it follows all of our ideas are dependent on the senses. All of our ideas are ideas of secondary qualities. So there's no such thing as an idea of a primary quality. Now, Berkeley considers two avenues of response that might be available to Locke. First, Locke might try to maintain that the primary qualities are generic qualities, like having some extension or other, or having some figure or other, or being movable in general. Berkeley points out, as I mentioned earlier, that this avenue is not available to Locke himself, since Locke claimed that everything that exists is particular. The Lockean view is that objects have qualities like being triangular or being orange, but objects don't have qualities like having some color or other, or being some shape or other. Berkeley doesn't want to rest his case on this point. Berkeley goes on to argue that let alone objects not having generic qualities, we don't even have generic quality ideas. Berkeley's thinking here is that if we take away all of the particular circumstances from our particular quality ideas, we're not left with anything at all. I think the intuitive force of Berkeley's point here is this. Descartes, Locke, and Berkeley all think that ideas are images before the mind. Now consider, do you have the image of a triangle in general? Can you imagine a triangle that is not an equilateral triangle? or an acute triangle, or an obtuse triangle? I think you can't. If you imagine a hand, I would think you're imagining either a right hand or a left hand, and not a hand in general. After all, what would it be to imagine a hand in general that's neither right nor left? Berkeley thinks that we obtain general knowledge not by inspecting our general ideas, but rather by inspecting all of our particular ideas, or perhaps by choosing one representative particular idea among a class of particular ideas. Locke's final avenue of response is to use his notion of resemblance in order to draw the primary-secondary quality distinction. Locke thinks primary quality ideas resemble qualities that are really in the bodies, while secondary quality ideas don't. Now, Berkeley's reply here is to say that it's impossible for an idea to resemble anything in a body. To see the intuitive force of this point, consider, is there a person in your family that you most resemble? It seems that there may be such a person. Perhaps you most resemble one of your siblings, or you most resemble your mother. But now consider, is there a number that you most resemble? I don't think it even makes sense to ask that question. How would you even begin to answer? The point is, things of radically different categories, people and numbers, can't look alike. They can't resemble one another. Two things can resemble one another only if they're the same general kind of thing. Now, Locke holds that qualities in bodies and ideas in our minds are different kinds of things. And so Berkeley's point is that they couldn't resemble one another. The only thing that an idea could look like is another idea. So there's no such thing as a quality that resembles something really in bodies. There's no such thing as a primary quality. Okay, now what I want you to do in your paper for this week is to try to present what you think is the strongest formulation of the Lockean primary-secondary quality distinction. In other words, if you agree with me that Locke's own formulation is a bit confused, try to give the best formulation of this distinction, and then try to present what you think is the best Berkeleyan criticism of the primary-secondary quality distinction. Imagine how you think Locke would respond to this criticism, and whether you think the response is successful. In particular, consider whether an empiricist can successfully draw the primary-secondary quality distinction. If, as an empiricist holds, all our ideas are acquired through the senses, does it follow that all our ideas depend on the constitution of our senses?